Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Disruptive Diner. I'm Dan Roos with Openly Disruptive. Thanks for being with us today. It is March 18th, 2014, and our topic today is surprisingly open, where we're going to take 3 looks at the world of open source and how that's much bigger than software, and it's not just about getting free software. The format of the Disruptive Diner is 3 talks. Each of our speakers has been asked to prepare a talk that's the Pachachkacha style, which is 20 slides that each stay on screen for 20 seconds each. That lets them come across lots of energy, really interesting point of view, and let us get on to the discussion, which is really exciting for us. So the first thing is, we appreciate your patience. Cut them some slack. Not all of them do this on a regular basis, but it's a fun way to do this and make sure that we have a really good conversation. Our first speaker is Scott Granneman. And Scott teaches at WashU and Webster University here in St. Louis. He's an author, and he has written, it's in its 2nd edition now. You're working on the Linux Phrasebook, 2nd edition?
2nd edition, I'm in the middle of it.
Yeah, so he's written on some open source tools, has done a lot of work in the area of security going back years, and talks to a lot of people about how to adopt technology. He's going to talk to us and kind of give us a little bit of a what is open source, what is that all about? Open source is not just open code that you can copy, it's also open data and open standards. It's about transparency and a way to work together. So I'm going to tee up Scott when you're ready.
I'm ready.
You're ready. And when we come back, we're going to have some questions and answers. So have your questions ready. Text them to me at 314-496-3457, or you can tweet them to just @Dan Roos. Which is R-E-U-S. So, and we are ready to go. Scott?
All right.
Start yourself when you're ready.
Thank you all. It's good to be here with this sea of faces in front of me. I'm going to be talking about open source today. So I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and talk about what the definition of open source is. And now my slides there we go. Want to misbehave. So this is the definition of open source from Wikipedia. Open source as a development model promotes universal access via free license to a product's design or blueprint and universal redistribution of that design, including subsequent improvements to it by everyone. Those are the cornerstones, the basics of open source. Now, you're going to see that this can apply to almost everything we're talking about today. That's what's interesting about the open source movement. They've taken this kernel of an idea and we've moved it to almost everything. In fact, if you think about it, it goes back to science. Basic science is predicated upon the ideas of open source. As Isaac Newton said, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. The idea of science is that it's published. People see it, they try it out, they test it themselves. If it works, they publish that and move on. Now, in software, though, there are lots of open source licenses. That's where most people, when they hear about open source, if they've heard about open source, they think software. And there are plenty of open source licenses out there that define various softwares and the rights that people have when it comes to using those. And in fact, there are some common pieces of software that virtually everybody in the audience today has used at some time or the other. You've used Linux if you've ever used Google. You've used Apache if you've gone to most websites in the world. You've probably used Firefox or the Chrome browser. Maybe you use Android. If you're a software developer, you use Git. The point is that you use open source all the time without realizing it. But there's more than just software when it comes to open source. Arduino is open source hardware. People are taking Arduino hardware and making fantastic things with it. Useful, cool, interesting things using open source hardware. But turns out that Facebook took that one step further and started the Open Compute Project, where they have actually published openly all the hardware standards for their data centers. It saved them millions of dollars getting ideas from other people. In fact, Microsoft has now joined Open Compute, which should tell you that must be a pretty good idea. But one of the most interesting uses of open source is Creative Commons. This is a project that's been around over a decade now, and the idea behind it is it makes it easy for people to share their work under certain restrictions. Say that you have to give me credit, or you can use it non-commercially only. Creative Commons has taken content from all over users all over the web and made it available to everybody for resharing. One of the most widely used open source technologies on the web is MediaWiki. This is open source software for creating your own wiki. Hundreds of thousands of wikis on the web use MediaWiki as their back-end software. Without it, we would not have access to the wealth of knowledge we see today on the web. And in fact, the most widely used website that uses MediaWiki is Wikipedia, which in fact are the people that develop MediaWiki and then give it away for free. Millions of articles. This is just the English Wikipedia, and there are 4.4 million articles today. Tomorrow that number will go up substantially, as it does every day. But there's more than just that for wikis. You can have the Wikipedia, a Star Wars wiki. You can have comic book wikis for Marvel, video game wikis. You can have lyric wikis for music, millions of songs, dessert wikis, and probably my favorite, Brickipedia, the wiki for people that love Legos and want to keep up with Legos. But now let's move on to education. MIT has been a forefront in this area with the MIT Open Courseware Project. They have published virtually every course taught at MIT on the internet for free. Anyone in the world can see these materials and use them. They're under a Creative Commons license. That gives you the right to use them, learn from them, remix them, as long as you give MIT credit. The Public Library of Science is a repository of scientific articles and journals that are appearing online in response to the high prices and proprietary nature of many scientific journals. It's made a wealth of knowledge available to scientists over the entire world. It's a fantastic thing. Creative Commons license there too. This is an example by Lawrence Lessig, founder of Creative Commons. He wanted to respond to an article on copyright, so he posted this on his wiki and asked the community to respond. And it turned into an amazingly detailed response about copyright on his wiki. It's freely available, and in fact, he's taken it and used it in a book he published, also created together with other people using wikis. This is an example, Open Cola. This is open source cola. The recipe is open source. You can download the recipe and make it yourself, or you can buy the soda from these people and use it that way. But it gives you the ability to take this recipe and tweak it, tinker with it, and make it your own if you drink cola. Here's an example, WikiHouse, an open source construction set for building your own house. And this is allowing people to innovate when it comes to making low-cost, affordable, innovative housing around the world in places where it may be difficult for conventional housing to work. Open source drug discovery is an example of using pharmaceuticals, developing pharmaceuticals in an open source manner, specifically for tropical diseases. This is started by some people in India to help lessen the scourge of tropical diseases in these countries by people collaboratively working together. OpenStreetMap is basically a Google Maps using open data that anybody can contribute to in the world, and the data is available for free to use in whatever application you want to. Apple uses this, for instance. Lots of other corporations and companies and individuals use this in their software. It's amazingly accurate. Public Resource is one of my favorite sites on the web. This guy is taking all the laws of our government and trying to make them public. It surprises most people when they find out that the laws that our government has passed and legal cases are not open and public. He's making it so. Now, the reason why all these people are supporting all these open source efforts all over the internet, all over the web, are many. These are some of the reasons: enjoyment, community, feeling like you're contributing to a community, educating yourself. There are lots of reasons why people contribute to open source. But the fact of the matter is the end result is proving to be truly wonderful things. And an example of eating my own dog food, my own presentation is available under Creative Commons license. So it's available for you to take, remix, as long as you give me credit. I like to give back to the community. I'm a firm believer in open source. And so these are some examples and ways that open source has expanded from far more than just software to ways that are helping to educate the entire world. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Scott. That's a great overview of open source as it comes, from the world of technology, and we start to see in some of those things like Creative Commons and things where it's actually going beyond that. I think one of the things to start off the discussion, there's this idea, and the great Lawrence Lessig quote up there and talks about Mark Halperin, actually, who's one of my favorite authors, who said shouldn't copyright be last forever, just like physical property.
Right.
So talk a little bit about why, if you could, why people feel like those two things are different. Why is it that creative things, so like code and intellectual property, is different than physical property?
Sure. The main difference between physical property and what I actually like to call so-called intellectual property, because I actually don't like that term for several reasons, is because property is something physical. If I take your shoes from you, you no longer have your shoes. If you have an idea, whether that idea is expressed as a song or software or something patentable, you still have that idea even if you share it with the entire world. So that's the big difference between physical property and so-called intellectual property. Thomas Jefferson himself famously said that he who lights his taper at mine does not diminish my own flame. And the idea being that, like a candle, if I light your candle with my candle, I still have the original flame. So that to me is the big difference. The internet has made it possible for people to not only share but collaborate on these products, intellectual products that make it possible in ways that never were possible before.
Yeah, it reminds me I was in China one time and kind of had a joking conversation with a Chinese business person about piracy and the problem of intellectual property theft, and he said, "Well, we're willing to address that as soon as we start getting those residuals on gunpowder."
Right.
So it really looks at your
although the patent on that presumably ran out
right,
a couple of thousand years ago.
It is all a frame of reference. So, but I think it's important, and that kind of builds on this a little bit, that the idea of open source isn't that, hey, take this and it's free. It's take this so that you can improve on it, share that with others, and we can continually rebuild it. Can you talk about how that, that iterative nature of it and that kind of that resiliency kind of springs up out of it?
Well, I would actually slightly disagree with what you said. Part of open source is, hey, if you want to take it for free and not improve it at all, just use it. Go right ahead. That's perfectly okay with open source. Most open source licenses, virtually all of them, in fact, that I know of. So if you want to take and just use, that's perfectly okay. But open source gives you that extra ability, that extra freedom to be able to take it, study it, break it down, and then improve it. And that's really the interesting thing about open source. There's freeware. I often have students say, so Adobe Acrobat Reader's open source? No, that's free. You don't have to pay for that software, but the license is not open source. Adobe does not let you disassemble that or change it. Right, you do not have access to the source code. So we have to distinguish between free and open source. Those are two different things. Now, the original open source is a widely used term. Some other people prefer the term free software, and they like to emphasize the freedom aspect of it. The problem is, in English, free can mean no price. It can mean free as in freedom. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that if something is free, it means it's worthless, it has no value, it's poor quality. That's why we have the term open source, because the term free confuses a lot of people, and so we have the term open source. Now, in a way to get around that, a lot of people like to use the term FLOSS, which stands for Free Libre Open Source Software, and that kind of tries to cover all the bases so no one gets upset. So that's some of the language matters, is what I'm saying.
A question came in. Are you aware of any situations where people, where an ecosystem that had started down the path of open source has actually pushed back and has gone to being more closed or proprietary?
Well, sure. An example of that would be MySQL. MySQL is probably the world's most widely used open source database out there. It was owned by Sun. Sun actually bought it, Sun Microsystems. Then Oracle bought it, and now Oracle is started kind of pulling things back a little bit. It's still available under an open source license, but it's also available under non-open source licenses, which the licensing allowed them to do. And this has proved controversial, to say the least, in the open source community. So there are examples of that. Usually they end up being dual licensed, because once something is open source, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and that's the difficult part.
There's actually, in the discussion guide, if you're watching along today,
Oh, sure. Oh, sure.
What other questions do we have? Just a reminder that you can text me at 314-416-3457 or tweet to Dan, or I'm sorry, at Dan Reese.
Let's replace.
So, with open source, there still is value, and you were making the point of free versus no cost. How do you create value from open source?
Well, you create value from open source in a variety of ways. So, for instance, one of the key things that open source is really, really, really good at is infrastructure. So, if you send an email, if you've ever used DNS, which if you've used the internet, you've used DNS, that's what translates when you type in www.google.com into a series of IP addresses or numbers that computers use. If you've used DNS, which everybody has, if you used email, if you've used the web, in other words, if you've used all these infrastructure tools to make money, to create value, then you've used open source. If you look at the example of Google, Google is the largest collection of Linux computers in the world. Now, they haven't released the exact numbers, but they have at least 1 million computers that make up Google, and those are all running Linux. Well, if you think about it from Google's perspective, it has not cost them any money to acquire that Linux software. On the other hand, if they'd used Windows, they would have had to pay a Windows license on 1 million computers, which would be a substantial expense and would have been money that goes to one of their biggest rivals. But by taking something open source and free like Linux, they've been able to extend it in ways that met their needs while not paying an initial cost to acquire. One of the key things I always tell people about open source is it may be free, but that's free like a puppy. It's free to acquire, but you have to spend money, time, energy, man hours learning how to use the software, and that's true with any software, but people tend to get hung up on that idea that this software is free. It's not free, it's free to acquire.
And that's why they let you adopt a puppy at PetSmart.
Yes.
One last question. Can you talk a little bit about, building off of that, there's even business models when you look at Red Hat and you look at what IBM is doing with Apache, tons of very large, very successful, very capitalist-oriented organizations have business models that are built on open source. Can you talk just briefly about that?
Sure. I'll give you a really good example. Apache is the most widely used software for powering websites on the web. It has been for 15 years. It still is. The largest contributor of code to the Apache project consists of employees that work for IBM. So IBM pays a lot of very expensive programmers to basically create code for free that goes into the Apache project that then anybody else in the world can use. Now, why would they do that? Well, they're actually making a lot of money by doing that, because if you're a corporation like GE or Anheuser-Busch and you're thinking about rolling out a bunch of Apache servers and you want to look to a company for technical support and services, if you go talk to IBM, the salesperson can say, well, the largest group of people that contribute to Apache are hired by or work for our company, and so we understand the code better than anybody else. We can make changes for you. We can help you out better than anybody else. Well, that's a strong advantage for IBM. And that's true for many companies that get involved in open source. They can sell services and support around the open source software because it has either become commoditized or because they understand how the software works through their own involvement. And that's really a powerful, powerful advantage for any company.
Right, and a lot of them look at it like an opportunity to really focus on where they provide value. To
Absolutely.
look at some of these things as, let's not put all of our resources into tracking bugs, into solving those kinds of problems. Let's put into where we actually add value, where people see the value of premium IBM.
A good friend of mine worked at a bio startup here in St. Louis, and they developed some software that solved some problem they had and automated some process. And they talked about it at a conference, and several people at the conference said, wow, we'd really like that. We really like your software. Is there any way we can get it? And they decided to open source it. And I asked my friend Robert, why did you guys do that? And he said, because we're not a software company. We're a bio company. And we don't want to get in the business of selling and supporting software, but by releasing it to the community, we immediately got improvements back from other people, and that made the software better, not just for us, but for everybody else. And it ended up benefiting everybody while not making us go into a line of business that we had absolutely no interest in getting in.
Well, great. Well, one more round of applause for Scott.
Thank you.
Scott's talk will be on YouTube later this week. His slides will be up, as you heard his licensing approach to his slides. When we come back, we're going to have Jonathan Leake. Jonathan is a technology guy here in St. Louis, involved with a lot of different groups, but he's going to talk about Build for St. Louis, which is actually a series of open events that are all around people being civically engaged and doing things for their community. And he's going to talk about that, and we're going to close that with a really interesting conversation about how open can actually lead to political change. Thanks, and we'll be right back.